Throughout the entire history of the NBA, there have only ever been a total of 3 Japanese-born players to get drafted into the league, with 2 of them having actually joined fairly recently. The first new player is named Yuta Watanabe, who was drafted in 2018 and is currently playing for the Phoenix Suns as a 6'8" small forward. And the second player is Roy Hachimura, who was drafted in 2019 and is currently playing for the LA Lakers with an average of 12.5 points and 5 rebounds per game. And while that may seem like a small number of people to have come from Japan, the part that actually fascinates me is the fact that both of these guys are coming from a country where it almost feels like basketball came out of thin air. Not that long ago, it was literally like trying to explain cricket to a dude from Louisiana, or like talking about American football to a British person. And for the longest time, Japan already had a massive audience for sports like baseball, sumo wrestling, soccer, and tennis. Yet for reasons that weren't exactly clear, basketball had just started to rapidly grow sometime during the early 90s, and a lot of people have begun to pinpoint this phenomenon towards one shonen series that came out in 1990. You see, players like Hachimura, Watanabe, and even their youth basketball teammates and coaches had all grown up being massive fans of a manga called Slam Dunk. And by 1993, a little company called Toei Animation had made a TV adaptation for the series that would go on to literally become a global phenomenon. One of the first times that basketball had ever even reached the mainstream media for countries like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, India, the Philippines, and about a dozen other places that, again, not that long ago, was like explaining water polo to Bangladesh. And so I wanted to look further into this. Reading all of these interviews and articles that were talking about the insane amount of influence that this one manga would end up having had me feeling like we might just be witnessing the byproduct of some strange ripple effect here. And so I was left with the question of, who is this guy? 2 seconds of Googling led me to an author by the name of Takehiko Inoue. And it didn't take much longer for me to realize that Takehiko Inoue was not just the author of one, but actually 3 separate series that have gone on to sell over 250 million volumes, having made Slam Dunk, Vagabond, and Real, which are all non-connected stories that would go on to leave their own dents within the comic industry. A guy who tried to finalize one of his stories through an entire art exhibition decided to go on an indefinite hiatus, and most recently became the director for what is now listed as the 5th highest grossing animated film of all time. A guy who has left even the most well-known authors and artists absolutely baffled by his work. People are convinced that he draws from magic and have even gone as far as to refer to him as the hand of God. And so once again, I had to ask, who the fuck is this guy? Did he really have this much of an influence? Did he really end up popularizing the sport in all of these countries? And if so, how did he do it? How did he become such a phenom of an artist? What other manga has he made? How do they feel so different from anything else? What other ripple effects has he caused? And why has he been on a hiatus for nearly a decade now? I don't want to talk about it. These are all questions that I hope to answer in a video that I've been wanting to make for the longest time now. A story of how this one guy went on to accidentally impact the lives of millions in ways we don't even realize. Or as I like to call it, the Takehiko Inoue effect. Born in 1967 in Ise, Kagoshima, Japan, Takehiko Inoue found himself growing up with a love and passion for 3 things: kendo, basketball, and drawing. The first 2 things were kinda a given because they were offered as club programs nearby his local school. But for somebody who would go on to become arguably one of mankind's most talented artists, I think the most surprising part is the fact that Inoue had never even received any form of academic training. Don't get me wrong, he always wanted to pursue an education in the world of art, but it was never really possible for him to afford it. A lot of his childhood was spent being raised by only his mother and his grandpa Masakichi, who at the time didn't have much money to begin with. But the reason why he was so keen on becoming an artist was because of one big motivator. You see, when Takehiko Inoue was around 11 years old, he had one day come across a manga that went by the name of Dokaben, which was a fairly well-known shonen series that came out in 1972 about high school baseball. And for whatever reason, he was absolutely obsessed with it. While they were really just a bunch of still drawings, he was fascinated by the way Shinji Mizushima managed to make it feel so alive to him. The way it was giving off the illusion of motion and making the characters feel like they were real people, which made him want to learn how he could possibly replicate that feeling. So in his free time when he wasn't playing basketball basketball or studying, he would constantly work on different character designs that had a variety of facial expressions. And by the time Inoue was a senior in high school and the captain for his basketball team, he was soon confronted by the question of, what are you gonna do with your life? Now that's obviously a million-dollar question for most people, but out of the three things that Inoue knew he had a passion for, there wasn't really much for him to work with. Pursuing basketball was kinda always out of the question since my dude stands at the height of around too short. And kendo wasn't really much of an option either because the only people that ever really need to sword fight nowadays are probably LARPers, which left him with a third and kinda already obvious choice. Drawing. But again, there was really no chance for him to ever afford going to an art school. So he actually went with an option number 4, which was to go to his local college in Kagoshima and study literature, a major that he somewhat loosely kinda was interested in a little bit. And that is probably just about the most relatable thing I think I've ever heard in my life. His first year studying at Kumamoto University quickly turned into a point where he wanted to start using his art as a means of making some money. Literature wasn't really his thing, and he knew that if he ever got the chance to be a mangaka, it would be like a dream come true. Especially because there was one night where Inoue's grandfather had actually come across one of these drawings and told him that the characters felt alive to him, specifically mentioning this about the way Inoue drew hair. And in a behind-the-scenes documentary about his process for making Vagabond, Inoue noted multiple times that this small comment meant the absolute world to him. The exact same sensation that he had felt from a manga like Dokkaben had now been used to describe his artwork by someone that he looked up to as a father figure. And it was after this point where he went on to start submitting a bunch of one-shots to different manga publishing companies, eventually catching the eye of an editor that was working for Weekly Shonen at the time. Here's an exact recreation of how this phone call went down. Oi, do you want to be like my assistant or something?
Fuck yeah, I do, mate. College is fucking cringe.
And then they kissed. So at the age of 20, he drops out of college and starts working as the assistant illustrator for City Hunter, which for the first time in his life became an opportunity to see what it was really like to be a mangaka. Probably overworking and balding faster than ever. He does this for about a year until eventually going back to publishing a bunch of different one-shots, more specifically storyboards that revolved around basketball, and even more specifically submitting them to Jump's magazine. One of these submissions was called Purple Kaide and actually ended up winning him the Tezuka Award. It was a short little story about a cocky but also talented high school basketball player named Kaide Rukawa, supposedly being so good that when he jumps, it literally looks like he's flying. And within the one shot, his main rival ends up being a tall, brash jock going by the name of Akagi. It was really cheesy and it was really simple, but it had enough heart to it that it made Inoue's name start doing its rounds within the industry. And then there was one night where he received a letter on his desk that was going to give him the opportunity to have his first real debut as a mangaka, an offer that was going to end up completely changing the course of his life. And it was a manga that went by the name of Chameleon Jail, which is about a guy named Chameleon who sends people to jail. Now, like most people's debut series, this one was not, good. And I don't really even want to rag too hard on Inoue for it because 1, he wasn't even hired to work as the writer for this series, he was merely paid to be the illustrator, and 2, it was written by a guy who somehow managed to have even less experience than a 22-year-old Inoue, and to this day I think this is the only thing he ended up working on because I'm yet to have found a Wikipedia article on this guy. And what I like to imagine is that Chameleon Jail was probably just the result of 2 guys in their early 20s having their own bit of fun trying to figure out what it's like to make a manga. But the results of that, however, was a guy named Chameleon who morphs into other people and then sends them to jail, which, by the way, I read the whole thing and I swear he only ends up using these powers like twice. Cause no shit. And again, I don't want to rag too hard on these two, but I really just cannot stop laughing over the fact that they decided to name the manga the name of the guy, which is the name of his power, followed up by the thing that he does with that power. That'd be like calling Superman Laser Mail. That'd be like calling One Piece Brazilian Rubber Tear. That'd literally be like if you wanted to make a story about high school basketball and then called it Slam Dunk. Oh. The The year is now 1990, Chameleon Jail ended up lasting about 6.5 chapters, and after Inoue had submitted dozens of more storyboards at this point, one day Jump magazine had finally decided to approve his dream story. He was given the opportunity to be the sole creator of a manga about high school basketball. But while it might have felt like a very surreal offer, Takehiko Inoue had already been working in the industry for about 3 years now, and was fully aware of how quickly a publisher like Shonen Jump would be willing to cut him off if it didn't sell well. There was also just no media coverage on basketball at the time. It was only ever mentioned twice before as a gag in manga. The first time was in 1979 with a series called Dash Kape, and the second time was in 1989 with a series called Dear Boys, which was by far one of the creepiest things I've ever read. Nevertheless though, he wanted to be the first one to ever create a story about Japanese basketball that felt grounded and honest, a lens for making people come to understand the love and affection that he grew up having for the sport. And on October 1st of 1990, Jump magazine released their 42nd issue with Slam Dunk's first chapter getting placed right at the front cover. So back to the present time of 2023, I went into these first chapters being ready to finally have some context as to why this manga would go on to become such a global phenomenon. And then I was left feeling even more confused. In the first panel, you're introduced to Sakuragi, a guy who stands at the height of around 6'3", glows the color red at the top of his head, and is pretty much disliked by all of his classmates. And that ends up being the case for quite a while until he meets another student that goes by the name of Haruko, who just so happens to be the only person to feel neither bothered nor intimidated by him, which for Sakuragi ends up leaving him absolutely speechless. He immediately becomes convinced that she has to have a crush on him or something, and she's like, no. And he's like, why? And she's like, because I already like someone. And he's like, why? And she's like, because he looks like this and because he plays basketball. And then Sakuragi proceeds to think to himself, I should play basketball, which becomes the main premise of this story, a stereotypical high school jock that learns how to play basketball because he wants to get at some ooh girl, consisting of chapters that are split in half between a cheesy, very simpy comedy where a bunch of the dudes are like, I like girl, but I also like girl, and the other half consisting of a tall, freakishly athletic dipshit learning how to play basketball for the first time. But the reason why I came out of this introduction feeling a little bit confused was because it left me with the sole question of, that's it? I mean, this is the first panel you see when you start reading Slam Dunk, followed up by watching what appears to be an unlikable force of nature try so hard to get at some girl over and over and over again. It honestly just screamed early 90s front, back, and center to me. Dare I say it, I would even go as far as to call these first 20 chapters bad. And I'm definitely not alone in that feeling. The most common speculation that you'll hear about Slam Dunk's rough start is that since Inoue was working with such a niche sport, the editors at Jump had actually forced him to write it as a comedy as opposed to a more serious story. And as this approach was starting to fall a bit flat, they then proceeded to gradually put Slam Dunk's chapters further and further back into the magazine. But honestly, I'm yet to have even found a single source that supports this idea. And what I think was way more likely to have happened was really just a matter of Inoue being a 23-year-old that was probably still looking for their own creative voice in the industry. Oh my god. And I also think it happened to be a matter of him referencing what was popular to put in manga at the time. I mean, this guy was coming from Chameleon Jail and City Hunter, for Christ's sake. It was kind of the thing back then to have that cheesy, nose-bleeding, simpy type of humor. And what I did find were many sources of Inoue acknowledging that there was a lot of room for him to improve on those early bits of Slam Dunk, even going as far as to say that as each weekly chapter was being released, he would actively pay close attention to all the feedback that he had been receiving from its readers. And honestly, I think you can see that in bits and pieces of those early chapters. Maybe romantic comedy wasn't really his shtick, but I could feel a bit of a spark in the moments that focused on basketball. It was almost like at certain points you were seeing Inoue share his own curiosity that he had with the sport growing up. Like there's a part where Sakuragi for the very first time witnesses what an actual slam dunk looks like. And there's just this awe that you can feel from him and everyone else that sees it. Almost like they had just witnessed literal magic. Like sure, maybe he joined the team just to get at some girl, but you wouldn't really have a desire to stay after practice if that was the only case. There's even other times where Sakuragi will be sitting in class or hanging out with his friends, and the only thing that he can really think about is this silly little club that he's now a part of. And I'm someone who spent their whole life growing up on sports. That's a one-to-one feeling that Inoue had to have written from his own experience. That weird obsession you have with something to the point where you're literally incapable of thinking about anything else. In later interviews, he had mentioned that this was how he wanted to introduce its readers to the sport, the exact same way that he first found out about it in Kagoshima. And if you look at the first pages of the first volume, there's actually a note that was left by Inoue himself when he first debuted this series. It says, "I was on the basketball team in high school. We weren't very good, but I had a great time playing. When you enjoy something so much, sometimes it's embarrassing. You try to play it cool, act like you could take it or leave it, but I've never felt the need to play down my love of basketball. And I don't really know why. This quote was stuck with me for like way too long. And then I suddenly had a galaxy brain moment with myself where I realized that this 23-year-old Inoue could have actually been onto something here. You see, I'm somebody who has never really been a fan of basketball. I literally didn't even know the sport existed till I was like 10 years old. I come from a Cuban family and grew up in Germany, so for me, it's always been one of those obsessions here in the States that I could never really understand. And so as I was reading this story about Sakuragi, who was slowly becoming more and more curious about this sport, I realized that maybe I am who this manga was meant for. And in context to the fact that Inoue was introducing this series in 1990 to Japanese manga readers, it kinda makes perfect sense. It was almost like he decided to make Sakuragi become the perfect lens to make people try and understand this sport. You have this oversized, naturally athletic guy trying out for a basketball team and doesn't know anything. And so he starts to ask questions like, how do they pass? How do they dribble? How do they shoot? What's a foul? What's travel? What kind of play styles are there? What's a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? And throughout the manga, you can start to see that Sakuragi's intentions shift here. While he may just be the most unhinged, short-tempered, gorilla-brained individual, you can see that with basketball, he has this really intense focus. It's almost like by sheer coincidence, Haruko might have just introduced him to something special here. Like very early on into the manga, he becomes obsessed with the concept of a rebound. Whenever somebody goes for a shot and misses, the best teams in the world can always rely on a player to recover it on both offense and defense. And the greatest rebounders are like the unsung heroes of a basketball team. They in some ways can control the whole momentum of a court. And for whatever reason, this became Sakuragi's new fascination. He wanted to be the absolute greatest at this one aspect of the sport. Sounds familiar. And I don't even mean that in some kind of fantasy superpower based logic. Everything that gets practiced throughout Slam Dunk are all things that Inoue himself had to learn as a player. Like there's a good 10 chapters that are literally dedicated to Sakuragi fixing his shooting form. Now, did these tips actually help me learn how to shoot?
2, 3.
Fuck no. But he did, for the literal first time in my life, help me understand the nuance behind this sport. That it's ridiculously fast-paced. You can feel good about yourself and then immediately be down by 12 points. Or the fact that one single position can have so much creative freedom. 2 point guards can play the role in completely opposite ways. And most importantly, what actually helped me understand the sport the most was the fact that this small little club program from a Japanese high school meant the absolute world to each and every single one of these characters. Whether it's the players, the staff members, the coach, the crowd, or even the fans, for 4 quarters straight, it's almost like nothing else matters. And what you end up witnessing is a group of misfit high schoolers who probably would hate each other in any other circumstance, yet somehow manage to come across this one thing that they all seem to mutually connect with. Maybe life's hard, maybe they have problems at home, maybe they're socially awkward or struggle in class or feel like they're lost in this world. But for 4 quarters straight, none of that mattered. And that to me was all the proof I needed to know that Inoue really gave a shit here. From this point on, I swear it was almost like my sense of time was starting to fade away. From chapters 1 to around 50, the team at Shohoku High can be summed up as Sakuragi, Akagi, Rukawa, and friends. Sakuragi ends up having a very bizarre playstyle where his body is able to do some of the most ridiculous physical movements, but his pea-brain constantly struggles to keep up with it, which makes it so that the only instructions they can ever really tell him is to just get the ball. Meanwhile, Ruka was the star player of this team and has been playing basketball for pretty much his whole life. The only downside to him, though, is that he has the social skills of a Brawlhalla player. You'll often see him hogging the ball and struggling to communicate anything past the phrase, "give me ball." And Akagi's the captain of this team. It's always been a dream of his to one day get a chance to play at nationals, but he's never really managed to find other teammates that ever felt as motivated as him. And that ends up being the case for his entire freshman and sophomore year until he eventually comes across these 2 dipshits. But it's not until around chapter 50 where this reaches its limit. At the end of the day, you can really only do so much with a team that consists of 2.5 players. And because the team needs to be able to beat their main rivals to get a shot at nationals, things were gonna have to change. And this eventually leads us to meeting the last 2 pieces of the puzzle, Miyagi and Mitsui. Miyagi was fairly easy to pick up because he's been playing basketball for his whole life and has a giant massive crush on the assistant coach, but picking up Mitsui on the other hand ends up being one of the most brutal challenges for not just the guys at Shohoku, but even for Takehiko Inoue himself. And what I mean by this is that for whatever reason, when Inoue decided to introduce this character into the story, there starts to be a drastic tonal shift in how slam dunk feels. In the manga, Mitsui is a guy that used to be an extremely talented shooting guard, but eventually had to quit after suffering from a knee injury. This led him to eventually getting a bit lost in the wrong crowd and finding a complete disinterest in ever wanting to play again. And then one day he gets approached by his ex-teammate Akagi, who offers him to be the last piece of the puzzle. He tells them to fuck off, but very quickly realizes that he's saying this to 4 guys who refuse to take no for an answer, eventually leading to a moment of dudes connecting with their gorilla ancestors and proceed to beat the living shit out of each other. But meanwhile, outside of these chapters, Takehiko Inoue had now been working on this series for over a year now, and you can tell that he had gotten to a pretty good groove as to how he wanted this manga to look. The cheesy, very simpy comedy that it started off as was now becoming a more serious and grounded story about basketball. And once Shohoku High manages to come out of this brutal beatdown with a new 5th member, this is where the real playing field starts to get laid out. Takehiko Inoue had officially placed the roadmap for Shohoku's main goal that they've been aiming for, Japan's national championship. And it's here where it feels like, and by the way, I have nothing to prove this. I have read every single possible interview with Takehiko Inoue, and at no point does he mention this. But right after this part, I swear on my mother that slam dunk has a way different feel to it. There's a certain zhuzh in the area where it's almost like Takehiko Inoue had a moment with himself where he said, fuck it, it's time to get serious. And then he just proceeds to tell the greatest sports story of all time. The intensity, the motion, the time Sakuragi hit this dunk, the time Miyagi got over his fear against Sano Industry, the time Mitsui hit his game-winning shot, the time Akagi was willing to comfort Sakuragi when he started crying, the parts where Rukawa looked like he was an unstoppable force of nature, and any of the points where this manga made you feel like you were either on the court or in the crowd witnessing what basketball is like in its most beautiful form. The fact that all I've been doing so far is showing you a bunch of still drawings, yet somehow each and every single one of these panels managed to bleed so much emotion and excitement. And I've said this before in a video, but I literally started to hear "The Winner Takes It All" by ABBA in the back of my head as I was reading this. And believe me, I would absolutely love to get copyrighted again to prove a point here, but I think my rent would like to say otherwise. But while all of this has probably gotten to a point where I'm just speculating here, I think in the 2 years that I've been making videos about manga now, the one thing that I have always felt about this medium is that you are reading the closest thing to what an author truly believes in. So when a guy like Inoue says that he wanted to do whatever it takes to make Slam Dunk a great story, I think the astronomical improvement in both the artwork and the writing can prove that for itself. These guys put so much of their time, blood, sweat, tears, pain, joy, experiences, and life-changing realizations into these stories that it practically becomes an engraving of who they are. And given the fact that Inoue had always dreamed of being able to replicate that same feeling as Dokaben, given the fact that he spent his whole life having so much love for the sport of basketball, to me, feels like it's all the proof that I need to see that this drastic shift in the manga was a moment where Inoue had answered that one question from high school as to what he wanted to do with his life. Not just be someone who studied literature and would take up drawing as some kind of hobby, but instead become one of the world's greatest communicators by making people understand the love, the affection, and the pure obsession that he has always had with the sport of basketball. And it wasn't long after this point where the reception towards Slam Dunk had slowly begun turning it into a global phenomenon. A lot of it was helped by the fact that in 1993, a little company called Toei Animation would begin releasing its weekly anime adaptation. This led to a huge fan base to start coming from overseas, and the other part of it was because the NBA itself was actually going through its own boom during the 90s. Coming into this decade, the league was receiving an insane amount of worldwide traction that had never been seen before in any other American sport. This was especially the case after Team USA had gone on to play in the 1992 Olympics with an Avengers team lineup of Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, Patrick Ewing, Scottie Pippen, and some other guy. And the other reason was because millions of new fans were coming into the world of basketball in hopes of trying to witness one of the most dominant forces to ever exist in sports history. A Chicago Bulls team that was being led by none other than Michael fucking Jordan in his prime. And if any of you happen to know anything about basketball or have taken more than one glance at this manga, you can probably tell where I'm going with this. Takehiko Inoue wanted to do this on purpose in hopes of fans being able to bridge the gap for the real real thing, which is why he made each school a direct reference to the most well-known teams in the NBA at the time. Shohoku High School was based off the Chicago Bulls, Kainan High was based on the LA Lakers, Shoyo School was based on the Boston Celtics, Ryonen was based on the Orlando Magic, Muradai was the Milwaukee Bucks, and weirdly enough, the final team that they would go up against in the manga Sano Industry was referenced in a bit of a different way from the rest. You see, in Slam Dunk, this team ended up being like the final Elden Ring boss of basketball. They were the defending national champion for 3 years now and had based their entire program around this one dude who was basically like if you made the perfect athlete from a lab. Eiji Sawakita was unironically born with a basketball in his hand, grew up with Olympic level genetics, and had been listed as Japan's #1 high school player, which made it so that when Shohoku would eventually play against them in the last arc of the manga, it literally felt like this guy was always 7 steps ahead of his opponents and made his mere presence alone become the biggest threat to a team. But what no one seems to be talking about is the fact that as Takehiko Inoue was working on this last arc of the series, he was actually basing this team off of a real high school named Noshiro Technical, which was a team being led by the actual #1 ranked player in all of Japan at the time. His name was Yuta Tabase and would go on in 2004 to become the first ever Japanese-born player to get drafted in the NBA. Mind you, this guy was literally like 5'7" and pulling buckets for the Phoenix Suns.
そうですね、もちろんそうですよね。ポイントガードですから。お、来た。スリーポイントだ。来ました。初めてのフィールドゴールも決めた。
And am I like the only one who feels like that's fucking insane? This is not a coincidence. Tabase was 16 years old and playing for Noshiro Tech during the release of these chapters. Like, can you imagine being so good at what you do in high school that one of the highest grossing series in your country was like coincidentally live basing a character off of you? So then after this, I did a little bit of digging and ended up coming across a recording of a 1996 Winter Cup final that Yuta Tabase had played in. But the strange thing about it was that for such a niche match from such a long time ago, it actually had a decent amount of views. And then I soon came to realize that this game just so happens to look exactly like the last arc of the manga. And what you will not believe is that if you zoom in really closely onto the crowd, you will actually notice that Inoue himself had attended this game. Okay, now I'm totally just joking. I'll take the tinfoil hat off. The other reason for why readers were becoming fans of the real sport was because Takehiko Inoue also wanted to write the characters in reference to the best players from the NBA at the time. In previous interviews, he's mentioned that he wanted the fans to try and figure out who was based on who. Looking back now, some of them were fairly obvious, like Rukawa's playstyle and personality was blatantly based off of Michael Jordan, even down to the same arm sleeve that they wear. Mitsui is said to be based on Craig Hodges due to the fact that they share the same number, come from the same team, and both specialize in three-point shooting. Sendo is said to have the same exact playstyle and footwear as Magic Johnson, and Akagi is said to be a direct inspiration by either Patrick Ewing or Scottie Pippen. But I think I'm way more inclined to find the similarities with Scottie Pippen because, again, Shohoku High School was written in reference to the legendary run that was being made by the Chicago Bulls at the time. Because at this point, I'm basically just listing off slam dunk trivia here. There was actually one time where Takehiko Inoue had received a fan letter that asked him to include their character named Steve Otaki into the manga, and Inoue found it funny enough to just actually do that. But then, why do I feel like there's somebody that I'm missing here? Why do I feel like there's a certain reference that I'm forgetting in this picture? Because I could have sworn that I remember watching the Last Dance documentary, and there was like 3 players that were leading the Chicago Bulls at the time. It was like Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan, and then there was one last guy. Oh, wait. Sakuragi is In March of 1996, the Chicago Bulls had played in a match against the New Jersey Nets, and towards the end of the first quarter, when they were tied 26-26, the Bulls ended up accidentally giving away a free layup due to a missed rotation, which made Dennis Rodman get so fed up with their lazy defense that he proceeded to slam the ball against the floor.
Nice slip pass to Gilliam for the reverse jam.
Dennis really lets it fly as a technical foul.
This leads to the refs giving him his first technical foul. Not long after, into the second quarter, Rodman went up for a rebound against Rick Mahorn, accidentally hit his arm, and the refs decided to call a free throw for the Nets.
And a foul coming up, I believe it's either Jordan. No, it's going to be on Rodman.
And for most basketball players here, you would really try to not make a fuss about this because another technical foul means that you'll get kicked out of the game. But Dennis Rodman, however, is not most basketball players, and instead decides to purposely give himself another technical and then proceeds to headbutt the referee.
Ted Bernard. It looked like he headbutted him.
Leading to him receiving a 6-game suspension and a $20,000 fine. And just look at the lack of a reaction from his coach. Look at how none of his teammates are ever surprised by these antics. Look at the way they let him go on 48-hour-long benders in Vegas, show up to practices late, start fights with guys that were twice his size, and end up finishing his career with a total of 212 technical fouls. And the only reason why they let him be this way was because he was not only just an incredible defender, but also the greatest rebounder to ever exist. To this day, there hasn't been a single player like him, someone who wanted to be a star player without ever scoring any points. And he got so good at it that during his season in '93, Rodman went on a 3-game stretch where he scored 0 points and made over 24 rebounds. It was insane. It was like the most unorthodox way to have people consider you to be one of the greatest. And most of all, it felt different to how anyone had ever perceived the game. Most athletes will spend their whole lives trying to replicate their in-game performance to how they play at practice. But for Rodman, however, the crowd and the pressure excelled him. It was almost like watching Dennis Rodman play was like watching a live performance. There actually was a time where he did crash a live Pearl Jam concert, and I just find it to be objectively funny that he stayed on stage for like 30 minutes and literally no one even questioned it. And I know I keep repeating myself here, but does any of this sound familiar to you? Right before their match against Sano Industry, there's a part where Sakuragi notices that a lot of his teammates were coming into the match feeling way more nervous than usual. And because of this, he proceeds to go up to the stands, jump on top of them, and yell out to the crowd that he was going to shit on their team right at their home court, which ends up causing one of the biggest uproars any of them had ever seen in their lives. And thanks to these cries and screams, Sakuragi proceeds to use that as fuel to end up having one of the best performances of their life. It's not just their appearance, it's not just their playstyle, it's not just their almost psychotic obsession with the concept of rebounds, it's not just the fact that all of Sakuragi's best moments are a direct reference to Rodman's most well-known highlights. There is no more of a crystal clear inspiration in this manga than the way Sakuragi displays the very life form that Dennis Rodman was to the NBA. Like, sure, maybe you can say that at the end of the day, these are just loose references, and maybe I've been going on a way too long schizo rant about basketball here, and if you're saying that, then you would be correct. This manga has unironically made me become obsessed with this sport, and I'd really love for somebody to make a Dennis Rodman documentary. But the reason why I think it's so important to know all of this, the reason why I keep going on and on about the origin of these teams, characters, and inspirations is because what really drives the message home for why this manga was able to make so many people become new fans of basketball comes from the fact that the core of this manga, the heart of Slam Dunk, is built on the foundation of very real narratives from the people who came to fall in love with this sport. It is a piece of media about basketball that absolutely lives and breathes the molecular making of what made people like Takehiko Inoue become so obsessed with it. I think it might even be the reason as to why this quote ended up sticking with me for so long. Because sure, maybe at the end of the day, all I'm really talking about here is just a comic book about 5 high school weirdos that try their best at something. But I have never in my life come across another piece of media that reminded me with such clarity some of the fondest memories that I ever got to share with the world of sports. Like the long bus rides home, or the Hell Week practices, and all of the psychopath coaches and daily moments where it felt like my body was gonna combust. But also even the things that I got to learn about myself through these struggles. Some of the closest friends that I have to this day were the teammates that I suffered with the most during college. And at the end of the day, it really just all ended up being like a silly little activity that we just really cared about. But I also think there's something beautiful to that. The fact that this one simple object can give us so many avenues to connect with one another. And I know, at least for me, it was these small little moments that would also go on to literally define the person that I've become today. One of the last moments in Slam Dunk is when Sakuragi finds himself in a position where he has to decide between subbing out or continuing to play in risk of a very severe injury. And it's here where he goes up to Haruko, a friend who stuck around this whole time to watch Sakuragi go from a loud, obnoxious, and insecure bully to now one of Japan's most prospective players. And he goes up to her to confess that he really just does love basketball. And while that may seem like a small little moment for readers to think that he was about to confess his feelings to Haruko, I think it was also a message from Inoue himself to show how much he had grown since the first chapter of this manga. Slam Dunk was practically unrecognizable at this point from what we first knew it as in the introduction, and it was almost like this one moment was about to be his last personal message to us as readers. With only a minute left in the match, Inoue proceeded to finish up its last 6 chapters with an energy that I'm yet to have been able to find in any other piece of media. I'm not even sure what words I could use to describe it, but for any of you that have ever read Slam Dunk before, you will know exactly what I'm talking about here. Because there's no room for opinion on this. The way this manga ended was like the definition of perfection. And then 276 chapters later, after serializing this manga for a total of 6 years, Takehiko Inoue had officially finished his debut series, Slam Dunk. A year later, he would come out with 2 illustration books that would vaguely show what all the characters were up to after the manga had ended, and it's now probably become my favorite thing that I have on my shelf. But then 1997 would end up being the year that he'd completely finished working on anything related to Slam Dunk, not long after announcing that he was fully ready to retire from his career as a mangaka, which in retrospect I think is fair. I don't know how you could ever even follow up the success of that or even feel the need to at this point, especially because the more I look into the Slam Dunk aftermath, the more I'm convinced that this man will never truly be able to comprehend the kind of influence that he ended up having in this world. The amount of physical copies that were getting sold during the release of these chapters are still the highest amount of weekly sales that Shonen Jump had ever reached in history, which then 2 years later had dropped down to almost half. And to this day, even though it's been almost 30 years since its last chapter, Slam Dunk is still listed as the 7th highest selling manga of all time, placed just above the likes of Demon Slayer, Bleach, JoJo's, Attack on Titan, and Hajime no Ippo. And that's purely just for the manga, by the way. The anime adaptation ended up being just as, if not greater, in terms of global success. Now, I was born in 2001, so I refuse to sit here and even pretend like I have the loosest idea of what it was like to watch this series when it first started airing, but there is like an actual cult following behind this show and the opening soundtrack. Hundreds of thousands of people from every single language you could possibly imagine sharing the inhuman amount of nostalgia that they have for this song. Parodies, live-action remakes, covers, Chilean metro station performances. They literally had to put signs in Kanagawa begging for fans to stop trespassing in order to recreate this scene from the intro. And in 2020, the Japanese women's basketball team had actually used it as their entrance song for the Tokyo Olympics. But I think he really meant it when he said that he was fully planning on retiring after all of this was over. Part of it was because he tried to work on a series called Buzzer Beater, which was a colored digital webcomic that was probably a bit too ambitious for the tech that they had at the time. He even decided to make a 3-chapter manga about his love for Michael Jordan, which I personally just find to be hilarious because it's shit like this that continues to prove how much he really meant it when he said this quote. But after that, I think Takehiko Inoue had finally come to the conclusion that there was nothing really left for him to pursue as a mangaka after having made something as grandiose as Slam Dunk. And he stayed true to his word. To this day, he has never gone on to do anything else with his career. He worked on Chameleon Jail, and then he made Slam Dunk. And then that was it. That was all he ever ended up doing with his career, because it would literally be impossible to ever make something that was better than Slam Dunk. Right? After going on a year-long break, Takehiko Inoue had found himself becoming absolutely obsessed with one of Japan's most prolific figures in history, Miyamoto Musashi. And this happened because the guy in 1645 wrote a book that would inspire Inoue's passion for wanting to make manga again. The first part of the sequence came from Musashi's Book of 5 Rings. These passages were only about 100 pages long, mainly consisting of his spiritual beliefs that helped shape his own combat strategies. And once I finished it, I soon came to realize that the reason why Takehiko Inoue had suddenly developed a fascination for this guy was because Miyamoto Musashi was like the Dennis Rodman of samurai. The main thing that people have come to know him for was for the fact that he managed to obtain an official record of 61 wins and 0 losses in one-on-one sword fights, which I honestly just find to be hilarious because I don't think I've ever managed to do anything correctly 61 times in a row. But the reason why I made the comparison between him and Rodman was because Musashi would purposely go against every single tradition that samurais had followed during the Edo period. Number 1, he used 2 swords because it was cooler. Number 2, he refused to ever serve under a master character. And number 3, rather than trying to fight people honorably by scheduling an appointment on which forest they'd settle their differences in, Musashi would literally just try to do every cheap tactic in the book in order to win a fight. He would often try to piss them off, run away, and use a variety of strange weapons that he felt like were necessary to his advantage. Most famously, he became known for these strategies in his duel against his main rival Sasaki Kojiro, who at the time was so tall in comparison to everyone else that he specifically learned to use a katana that was called the laundry drying pole. And because Musashi wanted to prove to the world that he was the best, he declared to, once and for all, fight this samurai Shaquille O'Neal on an island that is now called Ganryujima. The day comes, Musashi decides to purposely arrive 3 hours late and proceeds to beat the living shit out of him with a wooden sword that he built from the very boat that carried him onto that island. By the way, I just want to give you the reassurance that that is not a spoiler. The second part of this sequence happened in 1935, where an author named Eiji Yoshikawa spent 4 years working on his fictional series called Musashi. This was a 1,000-page long epic based around the narrative behind Miyamoto Musashi, where both the people he had in his real life are combined with many fictional aspects to tell a massive, introspective journey of a lone swordsman. And there was one day in the midst of Inoue's break where he had come across both of these books and immediately felt motivated enough to create his own depiction of these stories, which eventually leads us to September 3rd of 1998, where Inoue would announce that he'd be working with the Seinen magazine to release his very next series called Vagabond. Vagabond's story starts off with a teenage boy named Shinmin Takezo, who after barely coming out of a war alive, decides to set out on a journey to try and become the strongest swordsman to ever live. And he has every reason to believe that he could do such a thing. By the age of 13, he was commonly referred to as a demon child for having killed his first opponent with a literal quarterstaff. This actually happened, by the way. But the problem here is that this all kind of stemmed from his abusive upbringing. So on one hand, it's made him really proficient at what he does, yet on the other hand, it's made it impossible for him to connect with any of the people around him, which leaves him at first kind of pursuing this journey aimlessly in hopes that this might provide him with some kind of a purpose, leading to him traveling across all of Japan trying to take on as many swordsmen as possible. And if you're thinking that sounds like the exact plotline you would hear from a book written in the 1930s, that's because it is. One of the first things that Musashi does is literally walk up to a dojo with a wooden stick and announce that he'll take on like 30 people at once if he needs to. In another part, he finds a flower stem that at the bottom had an impressively refined cut, and Musashi becomes convinced that this cut could have only come from a veteran samurai, which leads to him traveling across the entire Yagyu estate, asking for who did this shit so that he can go try to kill them. Given that both of these guys were basing their story off of a dude that killed his rival with a fucking boat sword, I think over time I was able to understand why the beginning felt a little Baki-esque to me. Yes, I know it's pronounced Baki now, but I do think one of the main differences between the book and Inoue's adaptation was the depth that you got to see behind a lot of these characters. Eiji Yoshikawa was famously known for putting an insane amount of detail into the body language of even someone as insignificant as Akemi, going on to describe her as being so fragile yet calloused because it's the only way she feels like she could survive as a woman during this time period. And I think early on, Inoue might have noticed some of the limitations that came along with trying to put this type of writing into drawings, which now leads me to the segment where I talk about an incredibly specific artistic decision that I think serves as a reflection to where he decided to go with the story instead. You see, one of the things that I found myself becoming obsessed with was the way Inoue would go about changing the artwork in a lot of these early chapters. Either during or right before a fight, he would always switch up the character designs to make them in a kind of oil-painted style. And I don't think this was a matter of aesthetics. I think it was a direct reference that probably came from both Musashi and the Book of Five Rings. You see, the real Miyamoto Musashi believed in something that he would often refer to as the spirit of the thing itself. In his eyes, strength wasn't something that could be obtained physically. It had more to do with how centered one was with their own spirit. And I think for a lot of readers, it was probably a big surprise that for a book that was supposed to just be about combat strategy, half of its passages mainly consisted of him advising people to meditate and to really try to understand themselves before pursuing something. It's actually one of the big reasons why nowadays this book often gets put into the self-help category, and it's gotten so bad to the point that in my copy, the translator had to put like 50 disclaimers begging readers to stop using it as a guide for their weird business motives. But the reason why I mention all of this is because I think Inoue wanted to intentionally express that same spirit spiritual aspect to fighting. When Musashi comes across his opponents, there's a certain aura to these characters that often lead to some of his biggest conflicts. For example, in one of the earlier arcs, he comes across a guy named Inshin, who for whatever reason instills the fear of God into Musashi. Even though he was already able to defeat all of the other students with ease, there was something about this staff-holding Mr. Clean that made him shit his pants, to a point where in their first fight, he literally ends up running away in the middle of it. And it's not until after spending a lot of time grieving and reflecting on it that he realizes that a lot of these feelings have been rooted deeply within him from his childhood. There was something about Inshin that had reminded him of his own abusive father. And it wasn't really something physical. A lot of that fear came from the fact that he simply just didn't know anything about the man who raised him, which helps him come to the realization that what he's terrified of most are people that he can't understand. And in order for him to be able to defeat Inshin, he needed to understand him for the man that he is. And it wasn't until after this point where I had noticed that each and every single one of these opponents were like a meditative experience to Musashi. As someone who from a very young age had always been labeled as an angry little gremlin child, swordsmanship became in some weird way a tool for helping him understand both himself and the people around him. And this was a concept that the real Musashi would often refer to as the way of the warrior. He believed that if you spend enough time trying to master something, what you'll eventually learn is the person that you are to your core. And I think this way of thinking ended up deeply affecting Inoue throughout the making of his manga.
やっぱり自分の中、内側とかをどんどんやっぱり見ていくっていうか掘っていくっていうことをやんなきゃいけないんで、まあやるんですけど、それやっぱりきちんとというかちゃんと掘っていったらなんか結局根っこしか残んないじゃないですか。後からついたようなものっていうのじゃなくて、もっと根っこのものにたどり着くっていう。
I do need to mention though that while Miyamoto Musashi was quite insightful, he also spent the last 2 years of his life writing this book in a cave. So there's just passages like this one that say, "If you are a warrior, then you are a warrior. If you are not a warrior, then you are not a warrior. The way of the warrior is the way of the warrior. To be a warrior, look like a warrior, and stand like a warrior." But I think it was through these small moments that helped shift my understanding on what I thought Vagabond was going to be about. Because these experiences weren't just exclusive to Musashi. Inoue would purposely go through the perspectives of characters like Marahachi, Otsu, Takuan, Inshin, Denshichiro, Baiken, and Kojiro to show how these moments would constantly change who they thought they were. And for a manga that mainly gets advertised as being a samurai epic, I think what's most surprising is how often these chapters are simply about how people explored through the depths of their own mind, wondering why they turned out this way and why they decided to keep on going on this path. But even then, I think what gets asked most frequently throughout the story of Vagabond, and hell even sometimes in Slam Dunk, is the question of what does it mean to be strong? I think by now, it's no surprise to anyone here that Vagabond holds a lot of notoriety for its artwork. The experience of scrolling through any of these chapters is like walking through a literal art gallery, with each page being the byproduct of weeks, months, and sometimes even years of work being put into them. There was actually one day where my mom saw me reading one of these volumes, and even she said, "Wow!" And I'm of the opinion that the quality of any piece of artwork should always be measured through the approval of a Hispanic mother, but that's not just a feeling coming from people like me who have no experience with drawing. Even some of the biggest names in the industry have shared that same fascination. Oda has admitted in interviews that he'd been constantly keeping his eye on Inoue's work dating all the way back to Purple Kaide. And in an interview between him and Akira Toriyama, there's a part where Toriyama described Inoue's artwork as something that was beyond a skill that you could just acquire through practice. It was almost like as if he was born with it. There's also a part in that interview where Toriyama mentions that the reason why he came up with Super Saiyan in the first place was because he was sick and tired of constantly inking Goku's hair. In another interview between Inoue and Yasuhisa Hara, that is the author of Kingdom, by the way, Hara mentions that while he was working as Inoue's assistant during the making of Real, he quickly became convinced that Inoue's approach to manga was the truth. Now, these are some insanely hyperbolic descriptions being made by some of the biggest names in the industry. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that even for people who know oh so well how gruesome it is to be a mangaka like it's the back of their fucking hand, Inoue somehow still comes off as a magician to them. And then it was once I got around to seeing some of his behind-the-scenes process, it didn't take long for me to realize just how intense this guy was about making manga.
今日も朝方までやられたんですか？
まだ繋がってますね。ちょっと小1時間ほど寝ます。あ、今から。はい。 そういうことをし始めると死んじゃいますからね。だからそこは保つと。
なんでそこまでものを作るのに苦労しなければいけないんですかね。
いや、なんか間違ってんじゃないですか。
In March of 2010, NHK decided to dedicate a 50-minute segment that consisted of Inoue's work schedule, creative process, angry paper throwing sessions, and overall thoughts on the success of Slam Dunk. And it's here where he goes into detail about his 3-step process for making each chapter: the name, the pencil draft, and the final draft. The naming part is basically just a fancy schmancy term that mangakas use to refer to storyboarding, which mainly consists of rough sketches that map out where each chapter is going to go. But for Inoue, he says that this step usually takes him the longest due to his documentary-like approach. You see, in his mind, it was as if the world of both Vagabond and Slam Dunk had already existed, and he was merely just putting a camera around what they were doing. Which means that storyboarding for him was never a matter of coming up with what these characters say and do, but more so a matter of how to present all of these moments that had already happened. Which leads me to my absolute favorite part of the documentary. While working on one of his chapters, Inoue wanted to draw a pivotal moment of Musashi having a strong desire to pray. But as the deadline was getting closer, it was becoming more and more impossible to envision what this panel could even look like. And what made matters even worse was that he and his staff members were already way too far behind schedule. After several attempts, it leads to Inoue getting so frustrated with himself that he proceeds to slam the draft paper onto the ground. Then he politely tells the camera crew to leave, and not much later leaves the studio without saying a single word. The next day becomes the deadline for this chapter, and Inoue shows up to the studio at the ass crack of dawn. He proceeds to work alongside his assistants on the final draft for 16 hours straight, and by 2 a.m., the editor came by to pick up the manuscript. Everybody leaves the studio exhausted, and Inoue goes on to play a bit of basketball before heading back to repeat this process all over again. Now, do you actually want to see how that panel from earlier turned out?
これまでにない表情をした武蔵が
Now, do you want to know how he reacted to it?
井上さんの中ではダメだったんですか？ダメっていうか、途中ではもうなんで破ろうかと思いましたけど最終的には一応 OK なんですけど。
And what was then followed up by this was a 3-sentence long interaction that I have unironically become obsessed with.
豚骨ラーメンですか？社長は何ですか？
Now notice how he's asking him, do you want ramen? Not, hey, let's go get ramen. He's asking, do you want ramen? The point that I'm trying to get at here is that there truly is merit to people saying Inoue might just be one of the most intense manga authors to ever live. Look at how specific he needs his panels to be, to an extent where halfway throughout the manga, he fully decided to switch over from working with a pen to a brush. And I don't think there's anyone more qualified than Mr. Oil Paint McGee himself to try and do something as crazy as that. Because when he's not working on manga, he also just so happens to really like making absurdly big paintings. Fun fact, I actually got to see one of these in a library in New York. But the biggest takeaway that I got from this documentary was really understanding the price behind Inoue's work. It honestly sucks to see how much he clearly cares about these stories to an extent where it ended up taking such a massive toll on his body, with several nights consisting of him sleeping in his studio, ready to jump right back to work after less than 3 hours of sleep. Yet most surprisingly, when asked about his reason for taking so many hiatuses, he said that the real reason for his burnout with Vagabond came from the fact that he had spent so many years working on a character that was like a reflection of some of the worst parts about ourselves.
だからそのスラムダンクでそのポジティブな世界を描いて、ですごいなんか明るい部分、光の部分描いて、でその後に同じことはしたくなかったんで、やっぱりその反対のものを描きたいと思って描いて、それでなるべく自分に対して嘘のないように描こうとしたら必然的にその 暗い方へ行っちゃったんですね。それは
Miyamoto Musashi was not a good person. He came from one of the most violent upbringings and used that to lash out against the people around him. This was a big reason for why the real person ended up retiring from swordsmanship entirely and spent the second half of his life working in pottery, painting, calligraphy, and teaching. And I think the reason why Inoue was putting himself through all of this was because he needed people to understand why even a guy like Miyamoto Musashi deserved a second chance. And it was with this approach to Vagabond that had led to so many people, including myself, coming out of it with a genuinely profound experience. With people talking about how this manga made them want to overcome their own depression or their own addictions, or even how it simply got them to want to work out. And ironically enough, I ended up becoming one of those people. To everyone in my personal life surprise, I am now that corny guy who wakes up at 7 a.m. and starts their day off with either a 20-minute walk or by meditating. But after releasing the 179th chapter of Vagabond, 2004 became the year that Inoue would go on his first hiatus, going on to say that around that time he couldn't even muster up the courage to pick up a pen nor find the motivation to look at a draft paper anymore. Between the years of 2005 to 2010, he'd sporadically come out with around 100 more chapters, and then only a couple months after the release of this documentary, he would go on yet another 2-year hiatus. But then from 2012 to 2014, he would work on this one arc that felt completely opposite from anything I'd ever seen in Vagabond before. You see, there's a part where Musashi had come across a starving village that was slowly withering away due to the fact that their land could no longer grow any fresh crops. And Inoue spent the next 2 years working on just 21 chapters of Musashi learning about agriculture, where he'd spend weeks, months, and nearly even a year trying to do whatever it takes to help these people survive. Specifically, he does this because he finds himself really wanting to provide this one kid named Iori with a better future, a world where he didn't have to wake up every day questioning if he could ever get another meal. But it all eventually leads to Musashi realizing that there are just some things about nature that can't be saved. Yet for some reason, he just keeps on going. As a matter of fact, even the villagers join him and keep on going. And there's this one panel that I think kind of feels like it's a matter of Inoue trying to ask himself the same exact question. What does it mean to be strong? What is the reason for all of these people to wear themselves down to their literal skin and bones just for the slightest possibility that they might have a better tomorrow? Or in other words, I like to think that these chapters were a matter of Inoue trying to ask himself what is the reason why he himself keeps on going. And unfortunately, since Vagabond is yet to have received an ending, I don't think we ever got to find out what was the answer to that question. At least in this manga. You see, something that I haven't mentioned so far was that since 1999, Inoue had actually made the decision to simultaneously work on another series on top of Vagabond that was called Real. The premise mainly revolved around 3 main characters named Nomiya, Togawa, and Takahashi. And I swear I'm trying to go somewhere with this, but I actually think that the answer to all of these questions come from one single scene that has to do with both Takahashi and, of all things, a fucking wrestling match. Hisanobu Takahashi is a 17-year-old high school student who recently had his life do a complete 180 on itself when he ended up getting into a bike accident. He wakes up after being in a coma for 7 days and realizes that he can no longer feel any sensation in the lower half of his body. The doctor proceeds to inform Takahashi's mother that he'll most likely never be able to use his legs again. And later into that night, he cries himself to sleep wondering what he could have possibly done to deserve this. But something that I think is worth noting about Takahashi is that he kinda did deserve it. Prior to this accident, he was like the physical embodiment of a germ. As the captain of his basketball team, most of his time in school was spent bullying, hazing, and belittling all of the people around him. There's even a chapter where he makes a freshman shave their head in order to stay on the team, and the reason why he ended up getting into such an accident in the first place was because he was running away from the guy whose bike he had stolen. But over the span of around a dozen chapters, you watch him slowly descend into madness, realizing what was about to happen. Everything he had ever known about his own reality was going to change. From here on out, there was no basketball, there was no school to come back to, and even worse, he also begins to notice that not a single person other than his mother had come by to visit, making him have to confront the fact that all of his past actions have now left him here to rot in this hospital by himself. When his mom tries to comfort him, he proceeds to cut her out of his life entirely, and when taken care of by his dad, Takahashi goes on to tell him the cruelest thing imaginable: you talk as if you really are someone's father. This becomes Takahashi's rock bottom, and he becomes convinced that there is no coming back from this condition. Not much later, he proceeds to do something that I'm not even sure I can put on the screen and show you guys, but it's basically a panel where he repeatedly stabs one of his legs with a sharp piece of glass, all to make the point that he has completely given up on his life. If there has ever been someone that's told you this is a manga about wheelchair basketball, they are just wrong. By chapter 47, we get introduced to two new hospital mates named Shiratori and Hanasaki. Shiratori is a late 30s pro wrestler that recently got forced to take a break due to a severe injury, and Hanasaki is a gremlin shut-in Rust player that actually kind of likes being at this hospital. Given each of their own conditions, it had practically become impossible for them to be able to do even the simplest tasks, and over the span of about a month, you kind of just watch these three trauma bond over the fact that they've completely ruined their lives outside of this hospital. Yet still, there's a part of them that desires to become better. For Takahashi, this training made him stop thinking about the fact that he has completely tarnished every relationship he's ever had. For Hanasaki, being treated by nurses and doctors made him finally feel wanted for once. And for Shiratori, it helped him for a little bit, but by the end of the chapter, he made an announcement that he was going to do whatever it took to be able to wrestle again in 3 months. Shiratori explains to them that for his upcoming match, he was going to be facing his main rival Masazuka, who actually used to be his duo partner when he first got into the industry. Back in the day, they made quite a name for themselves, but eventually the head of the Japanese wrestling scene decided to split them apart. He felt that Shiratori's appearance wasn't fit for the role, so instead he was forced to turn into a heel. Masazuka went on to become the face of the entire industry, while Shiratori wanted to do whatever it took to become the fan base's biggest villain. He shaved his head, fought dirty, and did every cheap tactic you could possibly imagine in order to win a fight. He embraced every single aspect of his role and had become completely absorbed by the success that came along with it. He was by all definitions one of the most hated celebrities in all of Japan. But even then, Shiratori is only human, and the only way he could ever deal with the emotional weight of all of it was by drinking his thoughts away, eventually becoming something unrecognizable to even the people around him, to an extent where he had even become a villain to the people closest to him. It's not long after where it gets revealed that Shiratori's wife and daughter haven't spoken to him in over 20 years, and the reason why he so badly wanted to make it to this match was because he had mailed tickets to his daughter and wanted even the slightest possibility that she would show up. And then it finally happens. On chapter 73 of this manga, volume 13 of Real, Shiratori actually ends up making it to his match against Masazuka, and Inoue proceeds to spend the next 6 chapters dedicated to the build-up, the event, and the aftermath of fighting against his very own best friend. And there becomes a tiny moment where Shiratori, Hanasaki, and Takahashi all come to the realization that even after everything they've done to themselves, something that will always be guaranteed in this world is room for a second chance. I think what Takehiko Inoue has been trying to say through the lens of people like Rodman, Musashi, Sakuragi, Takezo, Shiratori, Hanasaki, and Takahashi, it's that even if you've led a life so far that you're probably not proud of, even if you've made an infinite amount of mistakes up to this point, it is never too late to grow from these experiences. And to answer the question of what it means to be strong, I think it's when you get hurt and choose to be kind instead. It's when you use it as fuel to help the people around you that have been through those exact same experiences, in the same way that you would for one of your teammates. And when I look at this panel from Vagabond and Real, I can't help but feel like I'm being reminded of the guys from Shohoku High, a group of misfit rejects that were ready to take on whatever was in front of them. And whether it's a teammate, a nurse, a coach, a mother, a friend, or a complete stranger, whoever it is, you'd be surprised by how many people are out there that are willing to help you on your journey of trying to become better. This, throughout the 34 years of Inoue's work, I think is what he's been trying to say all along. Later on, Inoue would actually get a chance to sit down and have an interview with Hachimura, Watanabe, and Yuta Tabase, with all of them getting to share the experience that they had with his series, each of them going on to talk about how they now both hold a bit of a responsibility in making sure that basketball continues to grow in Japan. Nowadays, the city that Noshiro Tech is located in actually has a basketball museum honoring both Yuta Tabase and Slam Dunk, and in 2008, Inoue would also go on to become the founder of a Slam Dunk scholarship that allowed for students to be able to afford competing in international programs. In that same year, he also made an entire exhibition that was supposed to be the canon ending of Vagabond. Originally, he was planning on finishing the story with a museum, but then immediately backed out after feeling like it was still incomplete. This is actually where a lot of these oil painting clips that I've been showing throughout the video came from. In 2013, he traveled to Barcelona to work on an illustration book about a famous Catalonian architect named Antoni Gaudi. I bought it. Don't ask me why I did that, because I don't have a good answer. Right before COVID, he worked on a couple more chapters of Real and then went MIA again. And then a while later, out of literally nowhere, he announced that he'd be directing a fully CG animated slam dunk film. And to be honest, I was one of those people that was like, what in the fuck? But in interviews, Inoue mentioned that he'd been asked about a slam dunk film for decades now, yet he declined every offer because he felt like the production studios were mostly just looking for a cash grab, which is why he just said fuck it and decided to make one himself. The theatrical release ended up coming out in 2022 in Japan, but I actually didn't get to see it here in the US until the summer of 2023. And by Christ almighty, did this movie end up exceeding everything beyond everything? Like, listen, I'm fully aware of the fact that I have a tiny bit of a fucking bias here, but I really did not expect for the slam dunk movie to end up being one of the best animated films I think I've ever seen in my life. If for whatever fucking delusional reason you happen to have had doubts that Sakuragi was Dennis Rodman, this movie was like the definitive proof of it. They literally animated Sakuragi's body language to the exact same playstyle and attitude to Rodman's, and you can clearly tell that was specifically decided by Inoue. And what's kind of funny was that I was completely surrounded by an audience that only spoke in Cantonese and was like twice my age. But as of 2024, all that we really know is that Inoue had recently announced that he'll be going back to working on the story of Real. And from what I've gathered so far, there's not really a clear sight of when or how he intends to go back to finishing Vagabond. Around a year ago, there was a misconception that he had announced his return from hiatus, but it was really just an interview where he basically said, oh yeah, I should probably go back to doing that at some point. And so I guess that just leaves us with the question, where exactly do we go from here? So in terms of Vagabond, I think it's really hard to know if we're ever going to see an ending for that series. At the time of recording this video, Inoue is almost 60 years old, unless you're watching this like 100 years into the future from a box that you found in a pile of rubble. Then in that case, he's probably dead, and so am I. But I think one of the main reasons why I spent such a long time working on this video was because I felt like Inoue's story reflected something that I've been wanting to understand since I actually had made this channel. Why is something as simple as a Japanese comic book capable of affecting people like me in such a profound way? Why does art make us feel such strong feelings to an extent that we start doing irrational things? And I thought that if I did enough research, I would eventually come across the answer to that. I even fucking interviewed people. I straight up made a tweet asking people to hop on a call with me and talk about their experience with Inoue's work. And then every answer ended up being different. One guy from India said that he read Slam Dunk and decided to start the first ever basketball club at his school, which has now grown to a point where there's a whole guys and girls team competing in their area. Another viewer from Indonesia said that she really resonated with Vagabond's depiction of religion because she herself was a devoted Muslim. I even got to talk to the guy who made this video. He was lovely. But then it also made me realize how ridiculous it was to try and think that there's one single answer to everyone's reason for connecting with certain media. And if anything, all I really needed to do was come to terms with that. There is no particular thing that can indicate the exact reason why we react in certain ways. All Inoue ever did was open his heart up through these drawings and let people decide what to do with that. I think we're in this never-ending cycle of things that inspire things to make us want to do stuff, create stuff, and there's not really a particular reason why. And instead of asking questions, I've decided to just enjoy that for what it is. If Inoue never picks up a pen again, I'm at peace with that because it doesn't take away from the experience that millions, including myself, got to have from his work. Because of this manga, a fuck ton of people play basketball now. Because of this manga, millions of readers felt like they wanted to look within themselves. Because of this story, I weeped noises that I'm not proud of over some wrestling scene, and because of this video, I ended up wanting to research Japanese history, research 90s basketball, read a 1,000-page long book that was written almost 100 years ago. After making these videos for more than 2 years now, I realized that I just wasn't put on this earth to try and answer every question. I think I was just put here to connect with the people around me over the randomest things that this world has to offer. These mangas gave me a certain experience, and I spent 9 months trying to express how that made me feel. It's been so long to a point that I don't know what this is or what it's become. All I know is that art is a creative process that tries to imitate life, and then life, for whatever reason, ends up becoming profoundly affected by art. Or as I like to call it, the Takehiko Inoue effect. Hey, so first of all, I just want to say thank you to any of the people that were willing to support me on Patreon. I physically would not have been able to make this video if it wasn't for any of you guys. And this will also be the part where I will shamelessly plug the page for anyone that isn't already on the Discord server or just in general are interested in seeing some behind the scenes stuff. So if by any chance you happen to want to recommend me stuff, ask me questions, want to see me rant about YouTube advice, want to watch some editing tutorials, or just happen to have a fetish for giving people money, I would happily be willing to help you on any of those endeavors. It's patreon.com/Alex at patreon.com/Alex. I'll say it one more time. Patreon.com/Alex, please, for the love of God. I also just want to say thank you to anyone that's made it this far into the video. 9 months is a really fucking long time, and I've chemically become a different person since the last time I've uploaded. I'm never gonna put myself through that again. I honestly wanted to give up so many times, but what really helped me was both the support from you guys and also just a lot of the people in my personal life. I know I just keep repeating myself here, but I do really mean it when I say thank you. This was really fucking hard to make, and I'm never gonna put myself through that again. I don't know how to end videos. I'm just gonna stop talking. Patreon.com/Alex.